I'm the Chief Product Officer at Alex Solutions, and we're a world-leading metadata management and data governance company. We've done this by, providing outstanding automated lineage capability, right from, automated discovery of data, automated discovery of lineage, and then automating data enrichment and augmentation in our harvesting pipelines, through to then representing that information in our knowledge graph, which is powered by our ontology, and then providing dynamic visualizations and intuitive navigation through that. In other words, we're a productivity platform that helps our users find, understand, and efficiently, use and govern their data. But that's enough of a sort of background on me and Alex. Let me just go into the topic then. So the agenda today, we're going to go look at what makes a successful data governance strategy. And being from Alex, I'll take more of a tools and a platform perspective on this. But look, starting with, data governance, it's a pretty overwhelming topic, and it encompasses a lot of different aspects. And so I'll go through a little bit about what we should be considering when we talk about data governance and what might be some of the factors that you need to think about. Then we'll look at open banking and take a practical journey through an initiative that an organisation's been asked to implement, and then look at what might be the considerations related to data governance when implementing that initiative. And we'll look at how data governance is playing a role in that. Then we'll take a more of a deeper dive and look at how data governance actually solved this problem or this initiative for open banking, looking at the key aspects of the solution, the role that the platform played in enabling that data governance. How did it help us to do things like plan for the implementation, or protect the data of the organisation, or helped us to govern for ongoing compliance. And then finally, I'll go through and summarise some of the critical capabilities you should look for if you're selecting a data platform, and what I would say are those critical capabilities. So before we go into open banking, let's look at data governance in a holistic way, in a more broad way. So outside of open banking, just more generally. So there's a lot of different things to consider in data governance. So when you look at these different factors, they might form the critical success factors for your organisation, depending on what's driving data governance in your organisation. But some of the things that you might want to consider are, what are the compliance requirements? What are the laws and regulations to which you need to comply? That's often going to be foundational anyway. So understanding those regulations, understanding who is the regulator, where do those regulations apply, to which data, to which use cases, to which business units, and then what are the reporting requirements in order to comply? What submissions do you need to make to the regulator? And then importantly, what are the consequences of non-compliance? What are the risks that the organisation needs to understand associated with those laws and regulations? Then you need to look at things like the stakeholders and the data domains and understand those. So what are the data assets? Who owns those data assets? And who owns the different business functions? What are the jurisdictions, the divisions, the organisational structures that we're dealing with? Who needs to participate in the data governance activities? Who's doing the tasks? Who's approving the tasks? And those sorts of things. Then we go into the operating model definition. What's the information that's going to drive the operating model? What needs to be managed as part of running the processes that form the operating model? Who's going to capture that information? And who's going to be responsible for maintaining it and keeping it up to date? And then what are the process steps involved, and what are the approval gates? Then we can look at designing the data governance workflows and the key performance indicators. So when you're defining those workflows, these are the workflows that drive and power the operating model. We need to understand what triggers the workflows. What are the exception conditions, or what are the events that cause the workflows to come into action, and who participates in those? And then looking at the key performance indicators, looking at how efficient and effective are these processes? Are there lags? Are we able to run them efficiently, or are we having to apply too much resources to them? Are there opportunities for improvement or automation? Looking at measures for compliance, like how well are we complying to the regulations? And then taking these measures also and looking at trends. Is the organisation improving its measures, improving its compliance? Is it overall improving its data governance maturity? And then looking at the people aspect, we need to incentivise people to participate in the compliance. So how would we do that? Perhaps promote the benefits of compliance. Things like, having people understand that the data is more reliable by adhering to compliance, right? We now have a common basis of understanding. There's more efficiency because we're exchanging information on the same basis, on the same understanding. Ultimately, this all leads to trust in the data as the organisation uses data in a more efficient and trusted and engaged way. Further things to think about when engaging and incentivising people is having them be part of the journey, have them involved in workshops, have them involved in defining the operating model. And they might be able to extend the operating model to gain additional value in other areas in their business units by just extending it a little bit. I guess another incentive more on the stick side of things is understanding the consequences of non-compliance, particularly for regulatory compliance. There might be organisational consequences and sometimes individual consequences. And then lastly, I would say you can gamify or socialise different aspects of the engagement. Have scorecards and leaderboards, maybe social interaction, shout outs, things like that to bring a human element to getting involved. And then finally, there's the implementation and planning of the governance itself, looking at the scope of what you're undertaking and the project planning and the estimation of that, the stakeholder engagement, who needs to be involved, who are going to be the champions in the rollout of the initiative, monitoring progress and status of the rollout, measuring the value that you're delivering, and change management and communication to take everyone on that journey. So these are the things to consider. They'll be different for different organisations. They'll be different for different specific project initiatives that might be used to support this data governance rollout. But across all of this is a lens of people, process and technology. These are, of course, the foundational aspects to it. So from a process perspective, what needs to be delivered and how is it going to be produced and who's going to participate in that? From a people perspective, who defines the operating model, who governs and is responsible for completing those tasks and running the process itself. And then from a technology perspective, this is a foundation of managing the information that's part of the process, the data management, and then standardizing processes through things like workflows, and then having everyone come together through things like collaboration tools. So that's the people, process, technology aspect that should be considered. But it should be remembered that this is a journey. It's not a single project. So data governance doesn't start and finish, it starts and continues on. The journey might start with a single initiative, like a regulatory compliance initiative or a system modernization. Perhaps it's migration to a new platform, or it could be establishing a new capability in the organization. Different initiatives will have different drivers that they're looking to achieve. So the first initiative can then be used to establish the foundation of the data governance capability. So the underlying drivers will influence the first foundation of the data governance capability. It might be compliance, it might be efficiency, it might be cost, it might be risk reduction. So whatever that driver is, that will influence the critical success factors that underpin the data governance capability and might set the scene for data governance in parallel with that first initiative, right? But the good thing about the initiative is it brings clarity to what you're trying to achieve. You really understand the outcomes that the governance needs to produce in association with that initiative. So it might be to be a data reference for an initiative. It might be to manage quality and have quality classification and monitoring. It might be to coordinate teams across disparate geographies or something like that. So then you've got a clear understanding of how data governance plays a role in the initiative that's being rolled out. Another key factor here is assigning ownership of the different aspects of data governance so that the momentum is not lost and so that you've got the champions in your organisation that are rolling it out. And then as you finish that initiative, that project, look to establish ongoing data governance capability. So build on that platform that was created in that first stage, build on the information assets, build on the capabilities. You might build on the operating model. You might improve on the responsibilities and the organisational structure that's used to drive the governance. And overall take the organisation forward in its maturity. So in this way, these capabilities, they become building blocks as you increase the maturity of the organisation. And then looking at it from a tools perspective, it becomes the glue and the foundation of the data governance activities. It becomes the source of reference for things like the data meaning, the quality and trust that you can attribute to different data, how it's being classified and informing the governance and policy rules that might apply, and understanding where that data came from, understanding the lineage and having that give you the context of that information. So all of that is then based around the platform that you're putting this information into. This information then forms a foundation for coordinating different activities, sharing knowledge across different parts of the organisation, a foundation for monitoring and governing the data status. And then that platform provides a foundation for data citizens to find, understand, and share knowledge about the data as well in the organisation. Ultimately, this builds a level of trust in the data and enables trusted data-driven decisions to be taken place, driving that organisational data-driven culture. So with that understanding of data governance as a whole, let's look at a specific use case. And this use case is open banking. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to explain what open banking is. So here, firstly, this is a compliance requirement. It's the open banking requirement is driven by the consumer data rights. It's the first phase of consumer data rights, which is being instigated by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC. That is the lead regulator of open banking as the first phase of consumer data rights. And consumer data rights is going to spread much more broadly across the whole economy beyond banking into other sort of sectors. So what does it mean for an organisation? It's going to need the organisation to share its customer information, its customer data with third parties that request that information. That includes competitors of the organisation, right? So, and the data that's being shared could be sensitive information. It could be personally identifiable information. So there's going to be a high level of governance required. The data holders are the banks. So they're called ADIs. they're authorised deposit-taking institutions. So these ADIs are the data holders, and they need to demonstrate compliance with the open banking regulations through reports and through dashboards that they need to stand up. And there's consequences for non-compliance. Those consequences can include fines, they can include removal of accreditation to the open banking access, and it can actually lead to court proceedings as well. So the consequences can be quite dire depending on what the breach is. It's being introduced in phases. So it starts with the big four banks, the major ADIs, and then phases in over time to the smaller banks. And on the right-hand side here, you can see there's 27 standardized products that have been defined under CDR, the Consumer Data Right. And there's 3 phases of introduction of this regulation based on which product segments we're talking about. So broadly starts with consumer products and then goes into more, let's say, commercial products as you go on. So looking at this, we now understand what's the driver. It's a compliance driver. Who's the regulator? We know it's the ACCC. What do we need to comply to? Well, we see that it's data sharing, it's protection of data, and we'll see more things that we need to comply to in a second. And what's the consequences of non-compliance? We also understand that. So now we've got a good understanding of open banking and what we need to comply to. What does it mean for us as an organisation to implement this? So the regulators stipulated here a set of APIs, application program interfaces. So these are APIs that need to be supported by the organisation. These APIs consists of open banking fields that form the payload of those APIs. So when I say payload, it means like the record layout that the APIs need to provide to the third parties. So when a third party requests data through one of these APIs, the data provider has to do a number of things. Firstly, it has to ensure that that request has come from an accredited source. So not everyone is accredited to use these APIs. So you've got to authenticate them. They have to validate that the consumer has given consent to share that data with that third party. Then they have to obtain that data from their internal systems. They have to standardize it into the formats that are required by the CDR standards. And then they have to provision it in a secure way to that third party. So that's a pretty broad scope, and it's very far reaching. So the journey here is going to start with a gap analysis. What are our current capabilities in supporting this initiative, right? What's our ability to manage consent, to manage data sharing with third parties, to manage quality for compliance with these standards, and for the content within these payloads? How do we verify the format that we're providing to these third parties? There's a lot of aspects here. So this regulation will necessarily require data governance by its very nature, right, to do these various different things. And so the organisation needs to enable and mobilise people, processes and technology to perform all these functions. And as indicated here in the orange, the technology aspect can help, the data governance technology can help with a subset of that, but there's obviously a broader organisational aspect to it to manage the end-to-end requirement here for open banking. So now looking at the complexity of this requirement, it shouldn't be underestimated or trivialized. There's quite a lot going on here. So firstly, if you're an ADI, if you're a deposit-taking institution, you've probably got millions of customers, you've got millions of accounts, right? So there's a huge volume that needs to be dealt with here, right? We're now standardizing all of that information into 27 products, okay? So that that standardization needs to occur, and there's some data transformation that needs to occur there, right? Then, once you've done that, we need to look at the data points that form these APIs, those API payloads. So open banking has 233 data points that make up these APIs. But also part of this regulation is a set of data that falls under consumer data rights. So they're still part of this regulation, but they're not strictly part of open banking, but they will need to be complied with as part of this regulation as well. And then we look at, okay, so that's what I need to format. I need to restructure that information to get it into those structures. And now I've got data controls that apply. So there's all sorts of different rules that apply to these data structures. And we'll have a look at some later. But these rules are adhering to things like lists of values. They're ensuring things are unique and various things like that. So how many rules are there that we need to adhere to, and how do we check for those? And then there's sensitive data. Some fields may not contain sensitive data. Others will contain sensitive data, and that sensitive data needs to be managed in a careful way. So then we need to understand, where is that sensitive data? So between the controls that we've got and the sensitive data we've got, we would need to profile that data to understand where it is and that it's being managed properly. So how much data do we have to profile? How many tables? How many columns? The volume is huge. And then how often do we need to do it? It's not going to be just once off as part of the first off implementation. It needs to be done regularly as we demonstrate compliance over time. And then looking at a stakeholder lens, we've got a lot of different business units involved in this initiative, right? There's IT, obviously, but there's going to be compliance, there's going to be security, there's risk and fraud, there's customer engagement for consent management, and there's head of product, head of customer. So a lot of different sort of business units. So how many stakeholders need to be involved? Who will own this? Who's the sponsor of the different components of this initiative? Who are the approvers? Who's going to run these tasks, right? So what this all means at the end of the day is it needs automation to be sustainable. This whole initiative needs to be underpinned by a data governance process that can be supported by a data governance platform. So let's look at how we would take this on with our platform and with our capabilities. So at Alex, we look at the capabilities we bring to the market in this way. So we bring a number of capabilities. One, we bring an ontology. So our ontology enables us to speak the language of the organization and configure things like properties and fields and navigation and visualization according to the requirements of open banking. Then there's the business glossary. So business glossary enables us to store the terms, the policies, the data controls, and link them within with each other to understand what it is we need to comply to. Then there's connectors, the connectors that enable us to catalog the data landscape, the lineage information, the data flows, and also profile that data, looking for quality exceptions, looking for sensitivity, and then classifying that data according to the open banking rules. And then we've got automated workflow to drive and power the operating model so that tasks are standardized and task progression controlled and not forgotten. And then there's dashboarding and reporting to monitor the progress of open banking compliance and help to produce those submissions that you might need to make to the regulator. So what we bring is an understanding of where the open banking data is and where these controls and obligations apply. It lets me focus my attention on where I need to take action. Where are my data quality exceptions? Where do I need to focus? And then it lets me operationalize my data governance framework through things like collaboration and workflow and so on. So that's an Alex perspective, but I'm going to broaden the topic now and look more broadly at what a platform needs to do in the space of open banking. And so looking at open banking, we've introduced a lot of different concepts, right? So we've introduced, for example, glossary terms, the open banking fields themselves, different definitions of things like identifier persistence has a very specific meaning in open banking. You need to understand that. There's data rules and policies that need to be understood and applied. There's the technical catalog itself. What's the data landscape from which I'm sourcing information? How am I transforming it? How do I ultimately fulfill my API out to the end user? All this information needs to be brought into a common repository. And there's also stakeholders and business units and organization structures. So all of this bring together, we call it a knowledge graph. So you need to bring that information together into a knowledge graph so that you can relate it and understand it. And this knowledge graph contains these assets. If I call them that, all these individual things are assets. Then I've got the properties, I've got the relationships, and I've got the interdependencies of all these assets to have a proper understanding of my landscape. In other words, this is the data that needs to be managed by the operating model, right? Our data governance operating model operates on this data landscape, yeah? So how do we make use then of this knowledge graph and how do we adapt it? And that's through configuration of an ontology. How do we need this knowledge graph to be able to speak the organization's language and also the language of open banking. And then through that configuration, it enables stakeholders to interact with the knowledge graph in a common way, in an intuitive way, through navigation, through displays of properties and things like that. So moving on from the repository then, we look at collaboration and automation. So for teams to be effective, they need to be able to collaborate around the data that they're managing. So different teams will be interacting with this data from different perspectives, but they'll need a common understanding of that data. So for example, some stakeholders, their objective is to govern the data, to protect the data, to secure the data, right? Others are trying to access the data. They're trying to transform it. They're actually trying to share the data. Both of these groups, all of these groups, need a common understanding of that data content, what the classifications are, and what the obligations are that are associated with it. So the platform needs to support these capabilities. And the knowledge graph needs to be augmented with these contributions from these different stakeholders through things like classifications and tagging and augmenting the descriptions and things like that. It needs to be able to coordinate activities across these different stakeholder groups through workflows. And then it needs to enable interaction with the different groups to foster that communication, foster that common understanding through things like discussions and sharing of information. So the platform in this way forms the foundation of this information, of that sharing. It's actually the metadata broker or the data broker in the enterprise for governance related information. If I now take a bit of a deeper dive into the platform and how it might look in a platform. This is actually a screenshot from Alex, but my points will be more generic. So what do we see here? One thing is, this is an area where I as a user can come and get a common understanding of what we're talking about. I see that I can interact with open banking terms. I can get an understanding of accounts. These different sort of terms, I can get an understanding of what these terms are, what the rules are, what the controls are, what the metrics and obligations are. So I've got a point of reference I can go to. I've got a search bar here. right? I need to be able to search and explore and learn. I need links out to external reference sites. Like I might need to link some of these terms to content that's actually documented by the regulator. This, these swim lanes and this navigation and what you see here, this is driven by the ontology. So the ontology drives the navigation. It makes the interaction simplified and lets me sort of customize what I'm looking at and make it really pertinent to open banking. And then I've got some hooks here already for stakeholder engagement. So I can see the icons that show me ownership has been assigned to these different terms. So they're the steward of that term, and they're my reference point if I need to get more information from the subject matter expert. I could highlight different terms to indicate they're critical or of higher prevalence because they relate to sensitive data and things like that. So a business glossary like this will be foundational to the platform. It needs to capture information like these data controls. So I said I was going to come back to the data controls, and this is an example for one data point, right? So we're talking about account data here, and there's 10 different controls stipulated by open banking and CDR. So the ID can't be null. The ID must be unique. Its status must be open or closed or can be null, right? It must align to a product category. And by the way, the product category has to be a specific list of values. The display name must not contain the account number. If it's there, it must be hidden or it must be obfuscated, right? These are different kinds of controls for one data point. Again, this is saying automation will be key in ensuring that you can comply and ensuring that your data actually adheres to all these rules. The platform would need to support also the profiling of data using mechanisms like pattern matching and pattern detection and other forms of rules to detect compliance and non-compliance, right? These profile outcomes would then run through a classification process to then indicate where you've got compliance and where you've got non-compliance. And then where you've got non-compliance, it should alert the data steward that that has occurred and maybe initiate a workflow in an automated way to standardize the response to those exceptions. And of course, at the end of the day, all of this information and the responses to exceptions and things like that needs to be recorded in an audit trail for evidence that you've handled the event and that you can demonstrate to the regulator that the controls are being applied and that you're actually managing those controls in that way. At the risk of being a little bit overwhelming here, I've got kind of a sample architecture that I'll just step through, and this will hopefully bring it all together to show how data governance would look in an environment and how the platform might be involved in this implementation of an open banking scenario. Okay, so this is just all mocked up, but so I hope you can see my laser pointer there. But what we've got here is we've got source systems. These are like our operational source systems that run the different operations of the bank. There are deposit systems, mortgage loans, you know, accounting systems, and so on that run our ADI. This is the source information that needs to come in through an integration layer into our open banking platform. So we've decided we're going to build an open banking platform and we're going to stage the data there. And that's the data that we're going to use to satisfy our APIs. And so it's come from the original source to this source of reference that's being used for these APIs. And there might be multiple stages of transformation to get this data into a form that is suitable for the API. And then we've got the APIs themselves, which then share the data out to a third party. So that's our technical platform. Okay, so now what's the role of data governance in this? So before we set out any of this technical landscape, we defined our open banking terms here in our business glossary. And so we've got a clear understanding of what our open banking terms were. And then we associated to that the data controls that are our obligations with all of those open banking terms. We can connect that to our technical landscape. We might connect it to our APIs so that we know which APIs utilize which open banking terms. Then we also know where we're getting that data from back to the source systems. We could also connect these, by the way, to our source here. So now we see right across the landscape which data is being used for satisfying our open banking requirement. How's it being transformed through this lineage to ultimately satisfy our APIs out to the right here, right? So I've got, with an understanding now, open banking fields, where they are in my data landscape. And also by this association of this open banking field to the data control, I also know what obligations I've got down here in my technical landscape. I can bring that all together. Now, I can use that information to start to configure my connectors that discover this data landscape. So I'll have numerous connectors. One is I'll have just connectors to discover the catalog and the landscape, all the tables and columns and files and data flows and manipulations and views, all of that that happens along this data pipeline. I'll have that discovered through my connector here. I'll have other connectors that will go through this data landscape and perform these data quality checks, right? So these are configured to represent the data quality checks that are defined by these business rules here in the business glossary. So I'll place them at strategic points along my data pipelines and profile the data and check the veracity of that data and make sure that it is aligned with the open banking formats, quality and requirements. I'll also have sensitive data detection in my connectors as well. And here I'll look for sensitive data in places, particularly places where it shouldn't be, where it should have been encrypted, where it should have been masked or removed. And if I've got exceptions to my data quality or to my sensitivity and the classification is not right, I'll be alerted. And so these classifications will create alerts, and the alerts will go off to my stakeholders, my data custodians, my stewards, and it might initiate the workflow that they need to use to take action and standardize their response to this event that took place, this incident that took place on the data. So that's kind of a thumbnail view of how an open banking solution would look and how data governance plays a role in that open banking solution, and how important it was in planning, because we understood these terms and understood then what we needed to comply with. We understood the scope by getting our understanding of where the data comes from and what we needed to do to satisfy these APIs. And then in governance of data quality and sensitivity, and then powering our operating model through alerting and workflows and that kind of collaboration. So now we've got that data landscape, we've got that data governance core capability stood up, and we can now use that information for other initiatives. Now that I've got this data landscape understood, what if I want to use this data for other purposes, like reporting purposes and so on? I've now got a data dictionary and a business glossary that help me understand how I can use it. So now, just in closing, the last thing I would like to do is provide some guidance then. If you're selecting a data platform to enable your data governance journey, what are some of the core things you should look for and consider as part of that selection process? So some of the things I would highlight are it needs to be technology agnostic, right? It needs to represent a range of different technologies on that one canvas. They need to be represented side by side. We need to unify this data landscape so that we can govern it consistently and holistically. And users of this platform shouldn't have to have an understanding of each individual technology in order to understand what's in the data governance platform. It needs to be cost effective. It needs to be easy to deploy, easy to operate, and needs to have high levels of automation in order to be sustainable and cost effective. It needs to help its users to locate, find, understand any data anywhere. So it needs to provide features to do searches, to do navigations, traversals, and browse through the content. It needs to empower users to learn and discover. It needs the ability to handle real-life complexity, the ability to represent many different concepts on the same canvas. Today, we talked about things like technology landscape, we talked about business glossary, we talked about data controls, policies, stakeholders, organisations, all of that combined into a knowledge graph, right? So some way to represent and store all of these different concepts and make them accessible in the one platform. It needs to have simplicity. It needs to be configurable to adapt to the language of the organisation, or in this case, the language of open banking. It needs to be easy to navigate and visualise, and needs to, that navigation needs to respond to the organisation's configuration and customisation. It needs to enable collaboration and automation. It needs to be a platform that enables information sharing, have workflows that enable standardization and powering of that operating model. It needs to have scalability. We're talking about deposit-taking institutes with millions of assets. They have hundreds of applications, right? So it needs to be scalable to handle that kind of volume in that one platform. And it needs to have impact and lineage capability. Lineage is critical to understanding the context of data. It drives trust in the data. Knowing where it came from will help you to understand whether it came from the authoritative source, whether I can use it for my use case, whether the right transformations and the right obligations have been applied to this data to enable me to use it. So I would say consider these when you consider a selection of a platform. And with that, I'll leave it there and open it to questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Rainer. That was a really excellent presentation. A lot of in-depth information there about open banking and the platform, and I really liked the solution that you put up there. We've got no questions from the floor at the moment, so if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A and we'll pick them up there. But one thing that I was intrigued about, when we're talking about the automation of the solution, you mentioned, I think you mentioned that there was an automation in terms of the lineage. Is it sort of do a discovery then and map that for you automatically? Is that how it works?
That's exactly how it works. So there's you know, that lineage is contained in data movement technologies. It might be ETL tools, it might be views, it might be other sorts of pipelines. So that automation will go through and parse logic, it'll parse logs, it'll look for different sort of repositories to build up that lineage information and make it available in the platform.
It's definitely a necessary thing, particularly as we move further and further into the consumer data rights world. And I know that the banking industry's finding it an interesting time at the moment, being the first cab off the rank.
Well, we see, I mean, the volumes that we see are quite staggering. When I was one of the founders of Alex, and when we started, I thought we're only talking about metadata. Metadata by its very nature is pretty small in volume. But we're seeing 30 million assets in our data platforms, and we're talking purely about metadata there. It's pretty amazing.
That's very powerful too. There's a lot to be said for an understanding of the breadth of this sort of problem, and actually trying to do it. There's no way you're going to do it with a bunch of spreadsheets.
Well, and I think that's a key message today, right? And I see attempts with spreadsheets, and they get you to a certain level, but it gets so unwieldy pretty quickly. And before you know it, you're building a platform, and you're spending. Sometimes I think of it as solving the wrong problem. You started with this initiative, you're trying to deliver this initiative, but now you're building something else that's actually readily available.
Yeah, it goes a long way to meeting a lot of the requirement, and I want to thank you very much for the presentation. I think you explained it extremely well. We've got a couple of comments saying thanks very much.
Thank you.
If there's no more questions, if there's a general inquiry, sorry. Arjun's asking, is there a governance on whether the data shared to third parties are used for agreed/appropriate purposes? So I'm assuming there's the questions about regulation in terms
of
that.
So you have to be accredited to participate in open banking. And I'm not going to profess to be an open banking expert, so I'll just call that out. But in order to get that accreditation, you have to explain the purpose of why you're going to use that data. So that would be part of receiving the accreditation as well.
Tiff has asked a question. Are you seeing other compliance regulations as triggers for ensuring data governance in banking or other sectors?
Absolutely, undoubtedly. It's one of the key triggers. We see a few, and I was calling them out before, around migration, modernisation. They're a couple of triggers, but compliance, we see BCBS 239 in banking. We see mandatory data breach reporting, so protection of sensitive data. APRA requires banks to demonstrate their lineage, and they use Alex to sort of show the lineage and show it in quite a conceptual way that we're able to aggregate and demonstrate that back to APRA to what they call attest to the lineage. So compliance is a huge driver, and particularly in the finance industry.
In my consulting work, I see it all the time. It's almost necessary to get traction from senior executives. Is really the compliance angle, and we saw it in Europe and America with the GDPR. It really drove a lot of data governance and data management projects, and we're seeing it now in Australia with the consumer data rights. So I think it's almost inevitable that compliance is a key driver. Compliance and regulation, key drivers.
Absolutely, and the thing about it is, when you establish that foundation, you need to leverage the capability for other positive use cases, right? Because otherwise you just see it as sunk cost. But there's really a lot of benefit to now having that catalog, having that shared understanding, having that collaboration. It can be used for so many other use cases.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we're coming up to 25 past. Thanks again, Rainer and Lewis, for organising this evening. I think it's been a great presentation, and as I said, this session's been recorded, so it'll be up on the DAMA YouTube, the DAMA Australia. Sorry, I should say that this is the DAMA Australia YouTube channel, and I'll put something on LinkedIn when it's up there.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So see you next month, everyone. Thanks so much for attending. It's been a good session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.